Hello, and welcome to Chapter 5 in our studies of social psychology. We'll begin this conversation by talking about some of the questions that we will be focusing on in this chapter. The first question is, can you have an unconscious attitude towards something that is the opposite of your conscious attitude? The second question is, can you form an attitude towards something without forming any beliefs about it? The third question is, does an attitude cause you to behave in a way that is consistent with that attitude? Or does behaving a certain way cause you to form an attitude consistent with that behavior? And the fourth question is, what impact do emotions and humor have on the ability to persuade others to change their attitude? These are just some of the questions that we'll be focusing on this chapter. So let's begin with a talk about our attitudes. So what is an attitude? It's our positive or negative evaluation of an object. We might have a tendency to evaluate something automatically. That's just one example. So what are some other examples? Well, like our beliefs, our feelings, and our past behaviors, they determine our attitudes either in and of by themselves, which is singly, or in combination with other attitudes. So there are three different types of attitude antecedents. They are the assumption that attitudes are formed through affective or emotional experiences that is reflected in classical conditioning principles and mere exposure hypothesis. The next one is the idea that evaluations are based on behavioral responses is reflected in operant conditioning principles, self-perception theory, and the facial feedback effect. And the third type of attitude antecedent is the claim that attitudes derived from cognitive learning is seen in a host of theories, including the theory of planned behavior and cognitive dissonance theory. Let's begin talking about our implicit and explicit attitude. An implicit attitude is activated automatically from our memories. So we might not be consciously aware of that. And that's when people have simple gut level evaluations. And they might say, it's just a feeling. It's a gut level evaluation. Okay, the second type of attitude is called explicit. And that is an attitude that is consciously held and is careful and deliberate. So implicit means it's a way to measure implicit attitude. Pairs categories of items with positive and negative stimuli. And this is all relates to what is called the implicit association test. So on the next slide, let's proceed a little more about implicit and explicit attitudes. So in regard to the implicit association test, that helps us to assess our reaction time to see if we are hearing good things with one category or the other. So both implicit and explicit attitudes, they might contradict each other, and that is called dual attitudes. And let's proceed about reference groups. Reference group is a group to which we orient ourselves. We emotionally identify with that group and whose standards we use to judge ourselves and others. And this is due to Newcomb's Bennington College study. And that showed that the effects of reference groups are profound. Now on this slide, we're going to be talking about mere exposure. That is exposure to a repetitive stimulus that can lead to developing a more positive attitude toward it. And that is if you do not have initial negative reactions to it. So the effect is strongest with children. And many attitudes are developed through it, and those are called implicit attitudes. So on this slide, we are showing a little bit of a graph about the frequency of exposure and liking. And it's showing that the more we are exposed to something, the more we gradually begin to like it. On the next slide, we will talk about classical conditioning. And there are some basic models of classical conditioning. And the UCS, that stands for unconditioned stimulus. And just to the right of that, UCR means unconditioned response. Now look on the second row right there. It says NS, that stands for non-conditioned stimulus, plus the unconditioned stimulus, and that can lead to an unconditioned response. Going to the bottom of this slide, it says classical conditioning can lead to attitude formation, for example, towards social groups. So they give this example like group labels that are paired with negativity in the environment can produce dislike for the group. Moving forward, feel free to pause the slide here and review this if you're interested and passionate about this topic. So the next slide, we're going to be talking about operant conditioning. And that's when our behavior is rewarded. It is more likely to occur in the future if it's rewarded. So receiving praise for holding an attitude is likely to strengthen the attitude. Moving forward, operant conditioning, slide number 2, it says our attitudes can be shaped by observational learning, watching the way others are rewarded or punished as they interact with an attitude object. Attitudes and nonverbal behavior. Nonverbal means maybe smiling or frowning, engaging in a certain manner of behavior. So smiling or frowning can cause a change in our mood, and that is called facial feedback hypothesis. And our posture and body motion can change our mood too. They tend to be unaware of the causes of the mood if this is occurring. So let's talk about cognitive dissonance. There's quite a few slides in regard to this topic. So feel free to pause the video and take your notes and get a little bit of insight into the topic. So cognitive dissonance, that means cognitive consistency states that people are motivated to keep their own explicit cognitions organized in a consistent and tension-free manner. But cognitive dissonance, on the other hand, is when we hold two inconsistent cognitions. So when we are inconsistent, we tend to feel a little bit cognitively uncomfortable and aversive. And how do we deal with that dissonance? Well, ways that we deal with that dissonance is changing our attitudes. The second way we can deal with that dissonance is adding cognitions. The third way is altering the importance of the discrepancy. Another way to deal with that dissonance is reducing perceived choice. The next to the last is making self-affirmation. And the final topic is changing behavior. So we talked about all the various ways that we can deal with cognitive dissonance. The next slide will give an example in graph form. Feel free to pause the video and gain some insight into this. So we're going to talk about freedom of choice and dissonance. That's when a person is forced into a behavior and they experience no dissonance, even if they don't believe or like the behavior. An example is, well, I did it because I had to. Going a little bit further about freedom of choice and dissonance. That's when a person who freely chooses their behavior, they don't like experiences about dissonance. And I gave some examples like, I did it and I don't like what people who do it. That is cognitive dissonance. You're thinking about how you do it, but you're also thinking about how you don't like people who do the same thing. Okay, on this slide, we've got another graph example. If you're interested and want to get insights into these graphics, please pause the video. So sometimes when we are experiencing cognitive dissonance, we try to justify our efforts and dissonance. So it says the harder, the more unpleasant, dangerous, and costly or degrading it is to accomplish something, the more a person values it. And once they have completed that effort, if they don't value it though, dissonance occurs. For examples, things like boot camp or fraternity sorority hazing. Or engaging in immoral behavior while you're experiencing that dissonance. And so there's two things here. Moral hypocrisy is the motivation to appear moral while avoiding the costs of doing so. So after committing moral transgression, people tend to try to justify the transgression, become a little more tolerant of immoral conduct. There's another graphic slide here. Once again, feel free to pause and look at this graph. Okay, after we make a decision though, and we experience dissonance, we might experience things like buyer's remorse. And we tend to regret that an alternative was not chosen. So like all dissonance, this is aversive. An example is when a person says, well, I am a smart person, but I chose the wrong thing. And so after we make the decision, we experience post-decision dissonance. We then change our perceptions of the alternatives we have. We tend to emphasize the good points of the thing that we chose, and we emphasize the bad points of the thing we didn't choose. Now, on this slide, we talk about cognitive consistency and one's culture. So consistency to behave in the manners in which one's culture behaves is more integral to individualist than collectivist societies. Now, on the other hand, when behavior within collectivist societies is ideally more concerned with being appropriate to the situation than with being consistent. So within a given society here, there are people with different tolerances for dissonance. And on the next slide here, we will talk about self-perception theory. That says that we infer our attitudes from observing our own behavior. We perceive our own behaviors the same way that we tend to infer others' attitude. And this is more likely to occur when behavior is freely chosen, our attitudes are vaguely defined, and we have very little experience with an attitude object. And this might explain how implicit attitudes become explicit. Now, once again, there is a graphic slide here. Please feel free to examine this on your own time. So, in regard to the theory of planned behavior, that explains when we carefully reasoned actions, when we engage in behaviors, we say, well, I meant to do this. I chose to do this. So our attitudes are only one influence on our behavior. And as you can see here, that does not account for quote unquote mindless behavior. So as we can see on this slide here, still talking about theory of planned behavior, that tends to hypothesize the most immediate causes of our behavior. And it doesn't talk about attitudes, but behavioral intentions. So according to this theory, what factors combine with attitude to determine our intentions? Well, as we can see, according to this graph here, our attitude toward a behavior, various subjective norms, as well as perceived behavioral control, those all go into one's intentions, and that leads to our behavior. Now, what is persuasion? Here's a good example of what persuasion is. the process of consciously attempting to change the attitudes of others through the transmission of some message. Okay, so social psychologists, they have determined that people want to be correct in their attitudes. And that is called elaboration likelihood model. And that is assuming that people want to be correct in their attitudes. And this elaboration likelihood model refers to the probability that the target of a message, persuasive message, will elaborate the information contained in the message. Okay, so social psychologists, they said that when they were learning about the elaboration likelihood model, there are various routes to persuasion, and there's what's called the central route, and that's when people scrutinize the message. And the other route is peripheral route to persuasion. And that's when people rely on heuristics or other effortless processes. So in social psychology, we have found that attitudes formed through the central route tend to be a little more stronger and less prone to counter arguments and lead to more predictive behavior. And there are various sources that influence persuasive abilities. And the first is called credibility. So you can see low credibility is a discounting cue. However, over time, the source's lack of credibility might tend to be forgotten, and that is called the sleeper effect. So on the next slide, there's more graphics about the sleeper effect. Please review on your own time. So there are various sources influencing persuasion. And the third is attractiveness. And that tends to be closely related to likability, similarity with audience, or physical appearance. Okay, so one's speech, one's pace, and one's tone can be very influential. So people who speak rapidly are generally more persuasive than those who speak more slowly, because fast talkers tend to convey the impression that they are more credible. And this is very beneficial when the audience's initial attitude is the opposite, that of the communicator. So let's talk about emotions and persuasion. So emotions can serve as information in the persuasion process or as motivations to avoid a message. So an example, like fear can induce helplessness if no clear alternative to the feared outcome is present. Whereas a sense of humor tends to catch others' attention. So let's talk about one and two-sided messages. So two-sided messages can kind of inoculate a person from an opposing view. So an example would be present a weak view of the opposing view along with the counter argument. And actively generating counter arguments, that means that tends to increase confidence in initially strong attitude. It does not increase confidence in initially weak attitude, on the other hand. So how about resistance to persuasion? There is successful resistance increases confidence in the attitude because people infer that their resistance was due to the validity of the attitude. So counter-arguing can produce successful and sustained resistance to persuasion. On the next 7 slides here, there are critical thinking questions. Feel free to review these on your own time and answer these in order to gain a little more insight into the topic. Okay, on the next 6 slides here, these are a summary of the information in this chapter that we talked about. So once again, feel free to pause, put this in your notes, and study this material on your own time. And that concludes our video today.